Comme vous le savez, les CoSavez, c'est une nouvelle initiative, un nouvel outil qui a été lancé par la direction scientifique de l'IRD pour remplir à la fois des fonctions de dialogue, de communication entre des chercheurs relevant de différentes disciplines scientifiques. L'un des enjeux, c'est effectivement d'intégrer ou plutôt de faire communiquer et travailler ensemble des gens qui viennent de planètes épistémologiques un peu distantes, celles des sciences expérimentales et celles des sciences humaines qui sont plus inductives, et autour d'objets, de 9 objets qui ont été identifiés par la direction, la terre et le sol étant l'un de ces objets. La CoSavez TERRESOL est coordonnée par Alain Broman, qui est microbiologiste des sols, et moi-même, qui suis socio-économiste et géographe, avec l'appui précieux de Mina Vilailek, qui est présente, qui a organisé cette session et cette visio. Et cette coordination, justement, essaye de réunir les critères, les compétences pour construire un dialogue entre sciences expérimentales et sciences sociales. La CoSavez s'est structurée autour de 4 grandes thématiques principales. Elle trouve sa filiation directe dans un programme qui a fonctionné pendant 3 ans, qui portait sur la séquestration du carbone. Et les sols et séquestration du carbone restent une des thématiques fortes de cette communauté de savoir. Les 3 autres thématiques sont la dégradation et la réhabilitation des terres, les dynamiques de l'appropriation et des usages des terres, et puis la question de l'agriculture et de l'intensification durable. Alors, ce sont des champs thématiques qui constituent un peu le périmètre et les champs de compétences forts des différents participants à cette communauté de savoir. Et le travail qu'on s'est assigné avec les membres de la CoSavez, ça a été de trouver des axes de travail qui permettraient d'établir des passerelles transversales entre ces grandes thématiques et qui sera à la fois des champs d'opérationnalisation du dialogue interdisciplinaire. Et ces axes sont précisément l'agroécologie, donc qui va constituer le premier abordage de ce webinaire. Et les deux autres axes de travail seront la Grande Muraille Verte, qui est un des grands enjeux d'intervention sur les questions de conservation et d'usage des terres, d'accès aux terres également, dans un milieu, celui de l'Afrique sahélienne, qui est sujet à de conflits importants, qui sont à la fois de nature foncière et politique. C'est un axe qui peut aussi constituer un espace de travail partagé sur des terrains communs. Et le troisième axe de travail, il porte sur la construction et les usages des connaissances, à la fois entre chercheurs et sociétés locales, chercheurs et instances internationales et niveau de production des cadres de l'expertise. Et puis toute la question de la circulation de ces connaissances et des usages qui sont faits de ces connaissances depuis les 2 perspectives, donc celle des sociétés locales et celle des instances internationales où sont produits les cadres normatifs qui opérationnalisent les interventions sur la terre. Voilà, je crois que je vais m'arrêter là. Cette présentation, les documents de référence sont disponibles sur le site de l'IRD. Ils sont actuellement en évaluation et reprises par la direction scientifique, mais vous les aurez très rapidement à votre disposition. Et puis, on est donc très, très heureux d'accueillir Yodit Kebede et les deux intervenants qu'elle a sollicités, Nathalie Moller et Thor Teixeira. Et c'est avec un grand plaisir qu'on les écoutera. Je crois que les interventions sont prévues pour une 40-45 minutes et puis laisser un débat de durée équivalente. Donc, bienvenue à tous les 3 et je suis très heureux de vous écouter.
Merci Eric pour cette introduction. Donc, comme Eric a dit, l'agroécologie est une des thématiques de la CoSavez TERRESOL. Et récemment, on a pas mal réfléchi sur comment faire la recherche en agroécologie. L'agroécologie, dans sa définition qui n'est pas disons, stricte et assez ouverte, qui donne plus des concepts, des éléments pour faire une transition vers une production durable et qui est plus respectueuse de l'environnement, pose un peu parfois donc problème de qu'est-ce qu'on y met dedans, comment est-ce qu'on intègre par exemple tout ce qui est connaissances locales, connaissances indigènes, quelles sont les implications de prendre en compte vraiment le contexte local dans nos recherches, tout en gardant finalement un objectif de générer des informations plus de paysage ou de contexte qui est aussi demandé à la recherche. Et donc, une des pratiques, des méthodes qui sont mises en écologie et qui est plus finalement à même de prendre en compte finalement les différentes connaissances et systèmes de pensée, c'est la recherche-action ou la co-conception. Et ces approches finalement vont questionner la posture du chercheur. Donc on se pose la question, donc quels sont ces changements de posture qui sont nécessaires du point de vue de l'agriculteur, du point de vue du chercheur. Quelles sont les étapes pour mettre en œuvre ce type d'approche, ce type de méthode, et quelles sont les implications aussi pour nous chercheurs dans nos méthodes, dans le temps aussi qui va être nécessaire pour mettre en œuvre ce type de recherche. Et aussi quels sont les impacts ou quels sont l'intérêt aussi de ces approches pour les acteurs. Et c'est toutes ces questions qu'on voudrait donc aborder à travers ce séminaire aujourd'hui. Donc, thank you very much for being all here, and particularly thank you, Nina and Heitor. I will give a quick introduction about you, and if you want to add something later on, feel free to do so, and then I will let you present. So Nina is associate, Nina Isabel Muller. So I will. So I was just quickly introducing Nina before she go into the presentation. So thanks, Nina, for accepting to be here today. So Nina Isabella Muller is Associate Professor of Political Ecology and People's Knowledge at Coventry University. And currently she's her research is focused on the biogenetic resource politics, especially seeds, about also subsistence and agrarian change in Down, and maybe still works there. Climate also and development finance, this is also one of her area of her focus. And she has also interest in sustainability, growth transition, and also the epicolonialism, so whose knowledge count. So those are the questions that Nina covers in her research. And Nina, if you want to say a bit more, feel free to do so afterwards. Heitor is assistant professor at Utrecht University, the Copernic, more particularly the Copernic Institute, Department of Sustainable Development. And he has been working in interdisciplinary research for more than 10 years, working with multiple stakeholders for the design and implementation of sustainable and multifunctional agroecosystems. I know Heitor from Wageningen University, where we did our thesis in the same group, the Farming System Ecology group. And he also worked a lot in connecting science with practice, with extension, education, with the use of participatory and innovative methodologies. And that's what he will be focusing on in his presentation today. So Nina, I give you the floor to put on your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Judith. And thank you everybody for being here. Bonjour tout le monde. Je vais parler en anglais. I hope that's okay. I am able to understand and speak a bit of French, but I think for this presentation, it won't be good enough. So let me just share my screen. Okay. Can I just get some feedback on whether you can see that now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. So thank you for the introduction, Judith. And I'm not going to add much to it. It's good to be here. So what I want to do today is to talk to you about the concept of people's knowledge, which is a term that we use at CORE. So I work at CORE, which is the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University. And at CORE, we use people's knowledge to frame and discuss our work on transdisciplinarity. And to do that, what I've planned is to give you a short history of participatory action research as background, and then briefly look at what can be problematic with participatory research, and then hopefully still have time to talk a little on how we try to address this in Agroecology Now. And Agroecology Now is an action research collective at CORE that I'm also part of. And maybe I should have, I'm wondering now whether I should have talked a little bit more on the role of knowledge in agroecology. And I could have, put up, I don't know, the 10 elements of agroecology from the FAO or the 13 principles from the HLPE, and sort of drawn out the knowledge sharing element of agroecology, and hence the importance of knowledge sharing to agroecological transitions. But I haven't prepared that, and I'm just hoping that background is not necessary in this group. Okay, so to begin with, and just to set the scene really, and also to respond to the provocation in the title of the seminar, that it is our attitude and not our aptitude that is important, I would like you to reflect on some words. So if you could consider the following words: knowledge, research, science, truth, or evidence. What do these signify? What do these mean? What do they make you feel like? And let's also think about what scientific knowledge is often juxtaposed to, what it is defined against, what it is not, what its opposite is supposed to be. So here is another set of terms: tradition, belief, superstition, folkways, ignorance. But just let them sink in for now, and just consider what they make you feel like. And then let me share some more words, which I believe come from the Australian Aboriginal activist Lilla Watson. And they go something like this: if you've come here to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So just take them in for now. Thank you. Okay, people's knowledge. What do we mean by that? People's knowledge is also sometimes called lay, traditional, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, amateur, ordinary, citizen, applied, practical, peasant. And while interdisciplinarity, or the addressing of a research question through several different disciplines, is widely celebrated, and in fact, it's become something of a standard imperative across many research contexts, taking into account people's knowledge is more problematic. It's often seen as inferior, as backward, less serious somehow. And this view is fed by a powerful discourse on progress and development, which was, and indeed continues to be, instituted by violent force. The idea of progressive advancement and societal improvement underlies many aspects of the organization of our world. And this idea was necessary to enthrone the white man and place European civilization at the supposed pinnacle of evolution in order to justify and enable the pillage and plunder that has been conducted in its name across the globe, and which also includes the domination and extraction of resources and labor from European peasants and artisans, from European populations, not just from the colonial populations elsewhere. So our world has been built upon the devalorization and the denigration of many things which could not be made to fit smoothly into the trajectory of technological advance and ultimately capital accumulation. And people's knowledge is often ordered by very different values and understandings. And this is one of the reasons why it is discounted. But this view of people's knowledge as backwards and inferior has always been contested by the supposedly backwards people themselves in social struggle, as well as by voices from the elite, from within the sciences, from within academia, and from within the educational establishment. So to clarify, from our point of view, people's knowledge refers to the knowledge and understanding of people who are marginalized in particular decision-making processes, or in scientific research, or in development practice. It is a way to value the views of community, especially when their understanding is opposed to expert and to institutional knowledge. What is important is that people's knowledge, as a theoretical and methodological lens, questions epistemic authority. It questions who can make legitimate knowledge claims, and it intervenes in knowledge production by including marginal voices. And this intervention in knowledge production is what transdisciplinarity is about. It's about taking other ways of knowing seriously and about working together on collectively defined issues. And this kind of intervention is important both for ethical, but also for methodological reasons. That is, this kind of taking marginal voices into account is both just and it is a feature of good inquiry. And in this view, people's knowledge borrows heavily from feminist epistemologies. So there is different feminist epistemologies out there, but common to all of them is the idea of situated knowledge, namely that knowledge depends on the knower's situatedness, how someone is socially situated, where they stand in relation to others and in relation to wider society, that will influence the way they understand the world, or that will influence the way they understand an aspect of the world. So people may understand the same object in different ways based on their social situation. And because it is situated, knowledge is also always partial, never total, and it is always embodied. By contrast, positivists and really many natural scientists view the world as a given, something that is out there for researchers to discover and to represent accurately. And the assumption is that carrying out research in a rigorous scientific manner will lead to results that accurately reflect the reality that the researcher set out to study. And because it is assumed that reality is out there, it is also assumed that no matter who goes to study that reality, the results they obtain will be the same. However, situated knowledge and the related, also feminist concept, strong objectivity, run counter to this positivist understanding of research. They involve acknowledging the partiality of all knowledge and its political, its historical, its social aspects. So on this account, the strongest approach to knowledge production is one that takes into account the most diverse set of experiences and that reveals relations of power that are usually hidden. Okay. We can go further than transdisciplinarity, however. We can go further than participatory research or this strong objectivity, including the usually excluded in knowledge production. We can try to produce knowledge or do research in order to achieve radical social change together with others. And that focus on action and transformation of unjust or oppressive conditions, is particularly highlighted in participatory action research, or PAR, P-A-R. So let me provide a brief historical overview over PAR. I think it's interesting. So PAR grew out of intellectual developments in Latin America in the late 1960s and 1970s. And originally it carried the name of militant research. So basically, in response to the effects of capitalist development, of the United States foreign policy at the time, the success of the Cuban Revolution, a number of Latin American thinkers developed methodologies that fused activism with empirical research. This was also done to decolonize their disciplines and to reject the positivist and the functionalist models that were fashionable in the US at the time in the social sciences. For example, La Rosca de Investigación y Acción Social was a group in Colombia that published books, established working groups to work with indigenous peoples and peasants in order to unearth the forgotten history of popular struggles and use those historical lessons to inform contemporary class struggle. Important names from America, which you may have come across, are Paolo Freire, Orlando Falsbora, and Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. But this movement reached beyond Latin America. It formed networks with thinkers from Asia, North America, Europe, and Africa, and a few of them are named here on this list. Perhaps the most renowned of these figures was the Brazilian liberation theologist and educator Paolo Freire, whose methodology of conscientization or critical consciousness sought to transform the political and social consciousness of working class people. He used a kind of literacy program in which literacy meant much more than learning to decipher print. It also meant identifying the relations of oppression under which they were forced to live and begin to formulate authentic and autonomous courses of action to transform the status quo. And this one now is a picture from a study group from Agua Negras in Colombia, where the artist Chalarca drew a series of graphic histories, basically a series of comics retelling peasant struggles. And they were developed together. This publication, Loma Grande, was produced collectively. Peasant activists in dialogue with militant researchers set the research agenda together, and the researchers would then go through local archives, interview elders, invite people to recount their memories at grassroots meetings. And Chalarca would take visual notes at these events and then shared the sketches with the audience, who would provide feedback and ideas for change. Of course, the origins of action research were part of the social and intellectual developments of this time. They were influenced and formed by social movements, civil rights, feminist movements, and also by national independence movements around the world. And important was also a parallel development in other academic circles. So scholars of the history, philosophy, and sociology of science began viewing science as one narrative amongst many others. And so they started to question, this idea of modern science as the one and only path to truth. And these critical texts ask many questions, including, for whom is science? To what end is knowledge being produced? Okay, it's probably also important to say at this point that participation wasn't the prerogative of radical social movements or of critical scholars only, okay? So participations, there were different currents of it throughout the 20th century, and also even before that. And some grew from the need to rule nations more effectively and to involve communities in state building and to ensure rural stability rather than uprisings and protests, especially in remote and isolated areas. So in parallel to PAR, other participatory research and development processes developed as well. For example, we have participatory rural appraisal, or PRA, which is often not much more than a technical exercise to improve implementation of development projects, and which thereby also circumvents questions regarding the very desirability of such projects in the first place. So what this means is also that the movement to radical forms of knowledge co-production is not a linear movement. It's not unidirectional. It needs to be struggled for again and again. And in the early 2000s, two important edited volumes, and you might well be aware of these, provided a thorough discussion of participation, not only as emancipatory practice, but also as tyranny. So Participation, the New Tyranny by Cook and Kotari began the debate in 2001, and Participation from Tyranny to Transformation by Hickey and Mohan, they responded to New Tyranny. Both pointed out and discussed such themes as intra-community hierarchies, which skewed participation. They discussed the co-optation of social groups, of how participation can increase ownership over a project or process, and thereby legitimate external interests, of how participation is also opinion forming. And that's because opinions aren't just discovered, but they're actively shaped in the processes of participation. And so how sometimes, opinions that come from external interests can be formed that way. And how participation can be burdensome for communities rather than useful for their own ends. In my own work with indigenous communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon, I identified 4 areas of conflict, which led to the failure of what was meant to be a highly participatory process of access and benefit sharing regarding indigenous knowledge and biodiversity. Contrived relevance as the first, the unquestioned assumption that the project and its objectives were relevant to people without having discussed that in advance. Second, fixed ideas of participation. So the terms of participation were set by, in this case, the NGO facilitating the project. For example, non-compliance and non-participation were not understood as signs for project irrelevance or weaknesses, but they were seen as failings on the side of indigenous participants. Another area of conflict was the myth of a level playing field. And so the violent colonial history was just ignored rather than acknowledged and addressed, and it prevented building relationships of trust. Eclipsing of other knowledges. Knowledge that did not fit into the project paradigm was silenced, which meant that opportunities for like a really deep going cross-cultural exchange and a dialogue were just lost. So when people were saying, we know which plants heal us because the plants talk to us, because the plants come and they dance around in our houses, instead of even just discussing what that means and trying to have a dialogue about that and explore how that might make sense in our different understanding. This was just completely, these kinds of expressions of knowledge were just completely ignored. So I believe that these 4 areas of conflict need to be addressed upfront in any participatory research project. And this requires something of us as researchers. It requires an attitude of respect for and an interest in the other, and an acknowledgement of our own partial perspective, a realization that we are steeped in systems of belief and paradigms of science which are never final and total, and which we hence need to hold lightly and look beyond from. In the research collective that I am part of, Agroecology Now, we aim to foster and nourish this attitude. And we do so by building a space for reflexivity and for critical friendship. Agroecology Now is based on a commitment to co-produce and mobilize knowledge with social movements, civil society organizations, intergovernmental bodies as well, policymakers, researchers, and food producers, in order to advance societal transformations for agroecology. And our ways of working include a number of different strategies and approaches, and I've listed some of them here. But as I said, one of the central aspects is the creation of a space, a community of practice which fosters awareness that power not only stratifies knowledge holders into particular hierarchies, with scientists and experts on the top and ordinary people and indigenous people at the bottom. But power also works to shape our very subjectivities. Power works to shape our own understandings, our opinions and feelings as researchers. And so together we aim to unlearn some habits of thought and some habits of understanding while we advance agroecology in various different ways. And so just to return to Lilla Watson's words, we aim to figure out the myriad ways in which our own liberation is bound up with one another's and that of so many others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nina. So we'll go to the next presentation by Ater.
Can you see it, Judith?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, nice. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to share a little bit of my experience. My name is Heitor Mancini Teixeira. I am currently working as assistant professor at the Copernicus Institute of Utrecht University, as Judith already said. But I am from Brazil, and since 2008, I have been working with agroecology in Brazil. And we have, and specifically in the region of Zona da Mata, where we have a long-term process of agroecological transition that is going on for more than 30 years. So it was very nice that Nina started, and she gave a very nice overview on the theme. And now I will give an example on how we tried to conduct a process of participatory action research in Zona da Mata, and what were the lessons learned. So first of all, I would like to invite you to reflect on how agroecology is impacting research methodologies. So as we already have discussed, in agroecological research, we seek to actively involve participants as co-creators of knowledge. And then I go back to Paolo Freire, already mentioned in the presentation of Nina, with a quote from him. So leaders who do not act dialogically, but insist on imposing their decisions, do not organize the people, they manipulate them. And then another quote, this is a very old one. And with the best leaders, when the work is done, the task accomplished, the people will say, we have done this ourselves. So agroecology is changing the way we do research, and it's crucial that we involve the diversity of knowledge and knowledge systems present in the region or in the study sites, in order also to have a higher chance to have a meaningful impact on the ground. So once we involve and engage with local actors, the chances of having results that can actually be effective and useful for farmers and other actors is much higher. And then another quote from Paolo Freire, the reality cannot be modified unless people realized what can be changed and what they can do. So in agroecology, we really change the scientific paradigm where researchers come with the solution to other ways of doing research, where we actually try to mobilize people, understand their needs, understand their knowledge, to work together to find solutions. And of course, we also need to involve local actors, because traditional knowledge is huge and it's very important and can actually help researchers to better understand the local situation and to conduct better research. So then the last quote from Paolo Freire, nobody is completely ignorant and nobody knows everything. We all know something and we all ignore something. That's why we are always learning. And and then I move to the reality of Zona da Mata and to the more practical aspects on how to facilitate participatory research on agroecology. So how to engage with farmers in the research process, how to enable horizontal construction of knowledge that is useful and effective on the ground. So based on our experience, we have come up with 6 components that we deem crucial in the process of participatory research. And I will focus my presentation in these 6 components. And these 6 components, they were identified throughout our experience in the Forefront program, which was conducted in Zona da Mata, but also in other countries. So the Forefront is a research program, which is cross-country, interdisciplinary, and collaborative. And it brings together Brazil, Mexico, and the Netherlands. So in Brazil, the project was conducted in the Zona da Mata region, which is located, in the southeast of Minas Gerais state, which is also located in the southeast of Brazil. And the Zona da Mata landscape is quite hilly, as you can see in this picture, which hampers the development of mechanization and allows the predominance of family farming in the region. And the main land uses in Zona da Mata are coffee, pastures, and secondary forest. So in Zona da Mata, we had this process of agroecological transition, which started in the 80s and brought together farmers' organizations, the local NGO, called CTA, the Center for Alternative Technologies, and the local university, Federal University of Viçosa. So in the Forefront program, we try to understand the process of agroecological transition and assess how we can scale up the successful experiences. And for that, we combined different social and ecological methods on multiple spatial scales. So we combined methods that range from social and ecological dimensions, and also that were applied in different scales, from fields to landscapes and farmers to communities. And here you can see some examples of the methods that were used and combined throughout the research. But as I said, my presentation is not focused in our research results. If you want to know more, we have many scientific publications that can be read, and then you can understand more about the local reality and more specific findings. But in my presentation, I want to focus in the process. So how did we involve farmers in the research process, and what were the strategies that we adopted? So to try to explain and understand this strategy, we identified 6 main components that were crucial. So the first one is the collective definition of research questions. The second one, the use of participatory methodologies for building scientific knowledge with farmers. Component 3, sharing the results with farmers. Component 4, integration between research and education. Component 5, strengthening interdisciplinary teamwork. And component 6, social engagement with farmers and farmers' organizations. So first of all, it's important to collectively define the research questions. So that means we went to different farmer communities and we attended to meetings of farmers' unions and cooperatives. And we had a question for them. And in the beginning, so from here, it's very important the way we phrase our questions and the way we present ourselves. Because usually when you go to a community of farmers, they expect you as a researcher to come and solve their problem. And that's something we cannot do. We don't have that power. And that needs to be clear since the start. So the question here is not how researchers can solve local problems, but how can we work together in order to understand and try to find solutions for the problems faced by farmers. So it's much more, how can we work together and how can research contribute to the process of transition that is already taking place, rather than how researchers can bring the solution. And then we did that in different municipalities. And we systematized all the answers in paper tags. So paper tags is something that we used a lot throughout the whole participatory process. And then we use these tags to systematize the information in each meeting. And then we brought it together afterwards. The group of researchers brought together all the answers and all the information from the different workshops. And we tried to cluster them and see how we could align our research ideas with the needs and the perception and the knowledge of farmers. And then the second principle or component is the use of participatory methodologies for building scientific knowledge with farmers. So this is also about the process, because these methodologies can also help farmers to better understand their reality and to reflect on how they can improve certain practices or try to develop better policies. But these methodologies, they also derive scientific data that can be used by researchers in papers to generalize results and create a more robust and scientific understanding of the reality. So, for instance, we used many different methodologies. For instance, participatory farm typology, which is useful to understand farm diversity and how the different actors interact within a landscape. We also used fuzzy cognitive maps to understand farmers' perceptions on ecosystem services. We used Venn diagram to understand the dynamic involving different organizations and how these organizations relate to each other and how they relate to the process of agroecological transition. And we used visual soil quality assessments with farmers to try to provide tools for farmers to assess and monitor their systems themselves. So the third component is sharing the results with farmers. So this is crucial. And because of course, we don't want our research to not be used by the local communities where the research was developed. And so therefore we want to share and to discuss the results with farmers. But, and it's an important but, we don't want to do that only at the end of the research process, because that's often what researchers do. So we develop our research, we get our results, and then we go and present the results to farmers at the end, if we can do so, because often in the end of a research project, we are running out of time and resources. So this is something that is often lacking. But it's important to go beyond presenting the results at the end of the project, but rather share and discuss the results during the research process. And this can be done in different ways. And this can also benefit the research itself, because during the sharing and the discussion of preliminary results, farmers can also contribute and add to the current knowledge. And this is an iterative process, and it's very important to incorporate different knowledge systems in the research. And again, there are different methodologies that we can use to share and discuss results. So we can use more traditional methodologies, for instance, just presenting slides and discussing the results with farmers. We can also use more interactive methodologies. And one of them is one of the methodologies that we developed in Zona da Mata is what we call artistic pedagogical installations. So basically, we built in this method, we build a scenario, and this scenario is composed by different elements. So we can use natural elements, we can use posters, we can use pieces of text, we can use poems, we can use soil, we can use any type of element that we want to construct a scenario that reflect the results that were obtained during the research process. And then farmers and the participants are triggered to reflect on these elements and bring their own opinion and their own perceptions. And in this way, we can not only share the results, but we can also bring new information that, because sometimes participants, based on the scenario, they come up with new ideas that were not previously thought by researchers. So it's a very interesting method that can be used to share research results with farmers. And then the second component is the integration between research and education. So we need to develop such a research process. We need to teach students on how to apply these methods and how to do science in a different way. So it's very important then to link and to provide students with the tools. So in many cases, we, as PhD students or as master students, we went to classrooms to teach the methods that we were using. And then we organized field trips where students could go to the field and apply the methods that they learned in reality with farmers. And that is very valuable for students. And I forgot to mention, it's valuable for students, but it can also be valuable for research, as the students, for instance, can help to collect data during the field excursions. And then the 5th component is strengthening interdisciplinary teamwork. So it's very hard to conduct such a project on your own or with a group that has only one type of expertise. So it's really important to bring together people with different backgrounds, with different learning styles, with different expertises. And it's important then to strengthen teamwork with capacity building during these meetings to basically train people on how to apply these methods and how to use interactive and participatory approaches, not only with farmers, but also during our meetings and during the development of the project. And finally, the last component is social engagement with farmers and farmers organizations. So for this process of participatory research to be successful, we need to build a relationship of mutual trust and respect. And for that, and one of ways for doing that is to engage with farmers and their organizations. So in Zona da Mata, we as researchers, we attended farmers meetings, for instance, peasant to peasant meetings, as you can see in this picture. But we were also attending to technical workshops, for instance, on how to build sustainable water treatment systems. We were visiting their markets and buying their products. So we were really engaging with their reality. And this is very important to build a mutual relationship of trust. And it's also important for research. For instance, in one of the meetings with farmers, before the meeting, I was looking for forest plots to include in my research. So I needed forest areas where I could go and take samples and analyze and measure the biodiversity of trees, but I couldn't find these areas. And then during one of these meetings, one farmer told another one that the forest area in his community was threatened. And at the same time, it was very important to conserve this forest because the forest was providing water to the community. And therefore, he wanted people to study the forest and to understand the functions provided by the forest. And then I was there, so we immediately linked and I could find my forest areas and he could, and the community could understand and the functions of the forests better and and have more arguments to protect it. So now moving to the end of the presentation, I would like to mention some take-home messages. So first is that participatory methodologies are key to acknowledge different knowledge systems in research on agroecology. And building a team of researchers with different theoretical backgrounds and learning styles is important for effectively engaging with farmers and their organizations and making research outcomes more relevant for society. But engaging with farmers and different knowledge systems requires extra effort and time from researchers, which is not always valued by academia. And here is an example. So I basically calculated how much time I spent during my PhD in this process of engaging with farmers in this participatory action research process. And what I see is that more or less 1/3 of my time was dedicated to build this process of engagement with farmers. So it really costs a lot of time and effort. And most of the time was spent in components that are not necessarily linked to my research or to my papers or to my specific tasks. So most of the components are related to the engagement with farmers that and these don't reflect on direct outcomes for research. And these other components are not valued by the system. So we need to somehow change this to allow people to have time to do this kind of thing. And then again here, academia should acknowledge efforts to engage with local actors. And it should also acknowledge efforts to produce materials directed to non-scientific communities. So how can we as researchers can produce other outputs than only scientific papers, such as technical reports or policy advices or just a booklet for farmers, things like that. And participatory research processes can be facilitated by long-term local networks involving organizations such as universities, NGOs, farmers' cooperatives, associations, and movements. So one of the reasons why the Forefront program was so successful in Zona da Mata is because we have in this region a long-term process of agroecological transition. So me, myself, I'm involved in this process for more than 12 years, but the process itself has more than 30 years. And the involvement of organizations is crucial to keep the process going in the long term. So that's it for now. Thank you very much. Obrigado.
Obrigado, Heitor. Thank you very much. Thank you both Nina and Heitor for this presentation. It was really exactly what kind of messages that I wanted to share with the community present today. And now the floor is open for questions. There are some of them which are already in the discussion, so I can start reading them out loud. Here I see one. So you can ask your question in English or in French, and I will translate. So a question from Nina: how to manage the internal conflict or leadership within a community to get a kind of real representation of this community and not only their opinion leaders?
Yeah, thanks for that question, which I think is really, really important, as I think that is one of the key issues with participatory research, is ending up working with people who hold already particular kinds of opinions or power within a particular community. And I suppose there are different ways to do this, and different researchers might employ different techniques. I have to say that in my case, one of the things, if it is possible to have more than just the participatory work in the place, but also a kind of an ethnographic element or some other longer term engagement with the people or in the locality, then of course, you get around some of those issues by being able to make connections with all sorts of people and already understanding the diversity of maybe opinion that are out there. Other people might decide to have smaller groups within the community that they work with, and for example work with women, have a working group that is women only, have a working group that is elders only, or young people only, or and then bring these things together. It is always an issue. On the other hand, we can also decide to to ally ourselves with people who hold certain leadership positions in order to strengthen their leadership if that feels like it is what we want to support, because I do think there is that aspect as well of making decisions of what we support on the ground. I don't know if that came out properly during my talk, but I think one important aspect is that opinions get formed during a participatory process, right? So we also form people's opinion as we do those kinds of processes, as we lead those, facilitate those kinds of processes on the ground, and so that that is a political act, and so there is a certain intervention there rather than just looking what people want, because sometimes, I don't sometimes know what I want, right? We have, or I want conflicting things. And so it's about working those out with people on the ground. I hope I answered some of that question.
Thanks. Ettore, do you want to complete with your own maybe your example that also you presented, like how this has been, how do you feel about those this question on the opinion leaders, which are sometimes taking over the participation of the whole community?
Yes, well, this is a very important aspect. And in our case, we use methodologies to try to break the leadership, or to try to give voice to people that are not leaders in the community. And then Paolo Freire and other thinkers, they provide methods and theories and tools that we can use to allow a better sharing of knowledge. So for instance, one of them is the circle of culture. I don't know if you have ever heard of it, but in a meeting, what we always do is that we have a circle, and then we can have a question or an issue to discuss, and each person present must say one thing at once. And that's it, and this you can have more rounds, but every person has the right, that has the chance to say one thing. And that really allows people to speak. And also, of course, the division in smaller groups, as Nina already said, and other methods that can be used to allow better participation. You're muted, Yoda.
All right. So a question also, another question for Ettore from Pierre Sylvie, who asked, like, agroecological transition is probably more urgent in the Cerrado biome in Brazil within the agribusiness system. Did you work also with large holding farmers using a lot of input? I think more also largely this question open to the conflicting relations that you have in the landscape, and very different actors which are present, and how to actually then involve with those different actors.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that somehow also relates to the previous question. So how do we involve the diversity of farming systems or the diversity of farm types present in the landscape? So this is very important. In our case, in my case specifically, I did involve large scale in Zona da Mata, which is around 100 hectares or 120 hectares, which compared to some properties or some farms in the Cerrado or in the Amazon, this is still considered a small farm, but for us it's a large farm, and they follow a very conventional way of production. So I also involved them in the research process. I must say it's harder to get them together because they are not so organized as the family farmers that have unions, cooperatives, and other means of organization. And this is the channel for us to access farmers. We go to their organizations, and then the organizations, they have a large network, and they invite all the people involved to the meetings, and they give us access to the farms. But I also wanted to broaden the scope. So I was just looking for all types of farmers and knocking their door and trying to explain the research process and involve them. And I was positively surprised with the results, because in most of the cases, they were very welcoming and they were very willing to talk and to even draw a fuzzy cognitive map with me and to talk about different things. So it also broke a bit my conception of large-scale farmers. So it's a gradient and it's not black and white. So we need to consider that. And in the case of the Cerrado, it's a little bit more complicated, because now we have this huge expansion of soybean plantation in the Cerrado. But at the same time, the work with agroecology is also very strong there, but mostly focusing on family farmers indeed. And then there are very similar experiences as in Zona da Mata, in the Cerrado, in the dryland areas. And we are somehow all connected, because in Brazil, we have movements that take place at national level. And these movements, they include scientific movements. So the ABA, the National Scientific Association of Agroecology, but also the National Articulation of Agroecology that brings together more than 70 organizations. And then in this way, we can share experiences and learn from each other.
Thanks for this answer, Heitor. There are two questions which are kind of for both of you. I will try to combine them. It's from Alain Borman. So some scientific knowledge could be conflicting with local knowledge. How could we handle that? And also he has a question about like how we can handle international researchers in the process, since they will not be always aware of local knowledge and local thinking.
Nina, you want to go first? Okay, yeah. So again, I think that's a really important question, but it's also a question, I think that sort of, that we almost automatically have before we've ever had the problem. So, you know, the question arises particularly before there is, you know, a real concrete issue between scientific and local knowledge. But it is true that theoretically, you know, there will be occasions when they conflict. And so my question is then, you know, in what way do they conflict though? For example, one typical thing is that a local community might recognize many more varieties of a particular plant than you know, the Linnaeus, like basically our biological taxonomy recognizes. So the question then arises, does that become a problem, and where does it become a problem? Does it become somehow a problem because some policy then protects, you know, maybe less variety of plants, or does it become a problem because the gene bank doesn't want to store all these different seeds because somehow science just recognizes one? You know, like what I'm trying to say is we need to dig in to where that problem actually arises, and then have a conversation on, you know, on how come that there is this difference, and how can we address that in that particular moment, rather than being sort of worried about it at the outset. Like, you know, use these differences to really dig in and really explore what is going on, and think about what the practical consequences are of this conflict. You know, maybe there aren't any, and it doesn't matter so much, or maybe, you know, they are really severe, and then we need to think whose interests are being addressed by you know, by pushing which knowledge forward. So that was one of the reflections. And the other one you said about, international researchers that might not be aware of local knowledge. Yes. And so, we need to, my feeling is that we need to make a real effort on, you might not be aware of local knowledge, but you can be aware of the fact that you are not aware of it, and that there will be a richness of local knowledge in the locations in which you work. And so, it's about taking that really seriously, and it's about making that making that an important aspect of the work, that you engage with that knowledge, or that the international researchers engage with that knowledge. And I do realize that has all sorts of implications for project lengths, for funding, for time periods, and all of these things. But this is part of the struggle, is to make sure that our projects are such that they can take this knowledge into account by working with local co-researchers, by getting an anthropologist on the project. Somebody commented on the chat. There are different ways to do that. It's just that we need to prioritize it.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I think like we are always going to face conflicting ideas, not only between researchers and farmers, but also among a group of farmers. You also have conflicting ideas. And I think the way to go is to be open about it, to discuss it with good arguments, and to try to find a common ground. So, I mean, there are always conflicts, and we are not going to agree on everything, and that's fine. And I don't think we should agree with everything, but we should be open, we should discuss, and we should manage to point out the direction we want to go. And for instance, one of the conflicts that we had in Zona da Mata is about the scheme of payment for environmental services. Some people are in favor of it, some people are against, within farmers, but also within researchers. So how do we solve that, And in the end, we found a way to solve it. And in the end, the project still worked. Some farmers, they got the payment, some not. Some just got the recognition, and we deal with the conflict. And I completely agree. That is on the second point on how to involve local researchers. So I think in research with agroecology is very much crucial to involve local researchers in the process. And in the Forefront program, as I mentioned, it is an international program, but the main researchers, they were, or at least we had main researchers that were from the study side. So for instance, me, I was a PhD student and I was Brazilian. The main researchers, Irene Cardoso, the main coordinator, was also Brazilian. And we were already involved in this transition process before this specific research project. And that was very important. And that allowed us to bring international people to the project as well. And then we expanded our perspectives, and we could also exchange knowledge and bring different ideas on the table. So I think it's very important to have international cooperation, but I think the lead of the research should, I think the research should be led by local researchers in collaboration with international ones. So I think it's, in other words, I think it's very hard for international researchers to come for 4 years and do this kind of participatory action research process. I think this is very hard, I would say almost impossible. So we need to cooperate with local organizations, with local researchers, and that way I think it can work.
Thanks, Heitor. I really agree with you. That's not that's something where we still have a lot to improve in project development, and to give more leadership to local researchers. One question that I have here for Nina, which is really kind of important question right now, because there are a lot of course, debates going on, right, actually, about decolonizing knowledge, about how agroecology is also being co-opted by different organizations. It's a question by Tom Wakefold from ETC. So he's about the power of words in power. And he said that the decision by some academics to frame peasant knowledge as agroecology, a term that is already being captured by agri-tech cooperation and US government, rather than, for example, peasant agroecology, has recently caused tension between professional researchers and global peasant movements. Do you have any reflection on this?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for this important point. So I don't know, to be quite honest, personally, I think terms can be co-opted, and terms that are successful in, rallying some resistance are going to be co-opted. So I don't think it's a surprise that agroecology has been co-opted. I don't think it's worth spending our effort and, infighting with people that we are usually allied with about the particular use of terms. What I think is really important, though, as part of this is I am somebody for, what we call thick description. So if we talk about agroecology, let's not just throw around agroecology. Let's be specific. Let's thicken up the term by explaining what it is we mean, by talking about, transformative agroecology, which brings justice, social justice to peasants, or, let's talk about, peasant knowledge. Let's talk about subsistence farming and what that means, and food sovereignty let's bring them together, and let's not just do the slogans, because I do think there is more risk of these things getting co-opted than if we thicken up our language and are specific and rich in how we explain what it is that we do, what it is that we want, and so forth. And then the other thing is, yes, I do think it's a shame that it can create conflicts between people who otherwise should be allied about which kind of words to use. And I'm a little bit wary of the sort of policing of language. But it is also important, of course, to make sure we get our messages across properly.
Heitor, would you like to add a few words on that?
Yeah, just maybe very brief. I think it's also important to think on that agroecology. Sometimes we just link agroecology to traditional agriculture or to peasant agriculture. And I think it's more than that, and agroecology is not only about copying traditional practices or copying peasant agriculture, but is about acknowledging different knowledge systems and bringing them together. And from the dialogue of knowledge, we bring new knowledge, and that is agroecology. And I think agroecology is not only for small scale farmers. I think agroecology can be for everyone that wants to adopt it. And for me, the question is more like, okay, what is in terms of size of land? So what size of land is sustainable? So what is the maximum size of land that we can work with in a sustainable way? And I think this is a question we should reflect on. But I think agroecology is for everybody. And of course, family farmers is easier for family farmers maybe to adopt, or for peasant farmers, because they have smaller farms, and then it's easier to manage, it's easier to observe, it's easier to experiment. But I don't think we should be limited to that. And sometimes also the use of terms is a bit confusing, because for instance, the term peasant, campesino, is not used in Zona da Mata, in the place where I work, but is used by social science scholars, So how can we match the concepts that are used by scientists and the concepts that are used on the ground by people?
Thanks, Heitor. I will take another question about the power struggle in knowledge. So it's a question from Alain again about saying knowledge as a power, and even in participating shame manipulation could occur. Is there some tools to avoid this kind of bias?
maybe I will go again, Aitor, if that's okay. So, sure. And it is, you know, it is really an issue, I think. And I think it's maybe more of an issue than participatory researchers like to admit. And so that's why I think it's really important to create communities of practice where we support each other and question each other, and, you know, where we have these conversations, where we have the conversations around, you know, our own power, our own manipulation of processes, you know, and discuss them in a group, and be really reflexive, be aware of it and be reflexive of it. And I think that's where, again, the title for this session comes in. It's something about an attitude, and it's not, there isn't a complete safeguard. And we are always in power relations all the time, of all sorts of different ways. And so we just need to be reflexive and be aware of them, and be willing to address these, and be willing to have them pointed out to us as well. And then to potentially adjust, you know, our actions.
Yeah. And just to complement that, I think, as I mentioned in my presentations, there are ways to do that. And one of the ways is discussing and sharing the results of the research during the research process, and not only at the end, to validate results from participatory workshops. So, for instance, we organized workshops on farm typology, and we gathered farmers' knowledge, and we systematized it, we build it, and we draw our conclusions, and then we present and we discuss this with farmers to see what they think, to see if our interpretation is right, to see if they have anything to add, or if anything is missing, or if anything is misinterpreted. So this kind of practice is very important, to keep discussing results and validating results in an iterative process, to avoid manipulation and to avoid biased results. And then there's a question from Tom saying that he never heard grassroots peasant smallholder farmers using the term agroecology, but in Brazil we use, in Zona da Mata we use, and in many other parts of Brazil we use, farmers use, and they say we are agroecological farmers, we are in the agroecological movement. So this is very strong in Brazil, and especially in some regions of Brazil. I don't know in others, but yeah, but for us, agroecology is a very powerful concept that brings together researchers and farmers, technicians, people from NGOs, because everybody feels connected to it somehow.
Also in Ecuador and Peru.
Okay, nice.
Thanks. I really agree that I think like the agroecology has a completely, you know, different story and development in Latin America compared to the context in Africa, for example, which is really feels quite more external process, and that's a big difference, for example, between Latin America and Africa. And there is a lot in terms of South-South cooperation actually that can be done, and that's in between those continents to really build also on the experience of the Latin America and see what can really be be useful or be used or be applied in the context of Africa. Eric, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you first for both Nine and Aitor for their two stimulating and complementary presentations. I just want to emphasize two challenging issues about participation. The first one has been already mentioned. Knowledge is a tool of power, and participation is a field of power. And including when you make sure that all groups are represented in a participation, organization, a meeting, that doesn't make you sure that there will be a true liberation of speaking, of free speech, that will not make sure that subaltern categories will be in situation to explain their point of view and their claims. Sorry for the video. Heitor mentioned in the presentation he did that we see a focus on formal organizations. What about non-organization sectors of society? What about absent people? And this addresses the second point I want to stress. We are increasingly working in pluriactive, plurilocated communities. How to take into account the voices and interests of non-residents people who have gained an increasing weight in social reproduction and socioeconomic dynamics. So that the 2 points I think that are really challenging issue regarding participation. Sorry for my poor English.
Thanks, Eric. Nina, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I think you are absolutely right. And these are crucial questions. But you bringing them up and you asking them is the very first step in addressing them and in finding ways of how to address them. And again, I think it comes back to what we discussed earlier with Heitor on, for example, working with local researchers, working with people who have a knowledge of the context. If now as an ethnographer, it's maybe a slightly different approach. Yeah. So I have, I am doing ethnography. There might be punctual aspects of my work that are participatory action research, but there is also a different kind of knowledge going on in my work where it is exactly about finding those power issues and looking for the people who have been excluded from other kind of processes or are involved in NGOs and in the big associations. But the first thing we need to do is to raise that question, and you do. And so, next time you're out there, that will be a question that you will be asking, who is not being heard here? And how can we get other people involved? And then finding ways, and these ways will always differ. There aren't like these, these methods, participatory methods aren't like, have them here and sort of apply them in the same way in all locations. They will always, have to be adapted, like agroecology, based on principles of getting, of including as many different voices as possible. And then how to work that out in reality might be different in different contexts. But there's not a real answer, but it's just, trying to say that it is a crucial point, and all we can do is to keep it alive in our awareness.
Yeah, and in our case, for instance, to understand farm diversity was very important to include the different types of farmers that were present in the region and sometimes not involved in the organizations with who we were working with. So for instance, as I mentioned, we had these meetings, and it's very important to engage with the organizations, but we were also going to work and to interview and to conduct research with farmers, with landless farmers that were working almost in a condition of, like modern slavery. So they were living in isolated communities. They had never went to the city center, which is a very small town, a municipality that is like super small. They had never had left the small community where they were living. And when I arrived there, they didn't want to talk to me. I'm Brazilian, and I was super, I know how to approach farmers, but they were like, no, I can't talk to you because I need to ask permission for my boss or for the owner of the land. And then we need to convince them, or not to convince, but to talk to them and to try to see that they can do that. They have freedom to take their own choices, and they can engage in the research process as well. And then with large-scale farmers is a different story, because they are not organized and they are often not interested in this kind of thing. But what I found is that in the end, they somehow are as well. And we need to find maybe a different language to talk to them, but we definitely should. And for me, one of the biggest obstacles is that this whole process of participatory action research is not recognized and is not really coming out in the academia or in the knowledge in the system of the universities. So, for instance, I'm a natural scientist. My research is about, linking biodiversity and ecosystem services, measuring soil, measuring plants, and maybe a little bit of farmers' perceptions and farm typology. But still, I engaged in this process, which is all extra and was not in my thesis in the end. And I was not, valued by that, by the committee or something. So how can we change this? And how can we allow natural scientists, social science, everybody to work with this process that takes time, that takes effort, but is super important. And in the end, it was important as well for my natural science research. It was also important, as I mentioned, with the forest plots, and all the and many other aspects and examples. But yeah.
Thanks, Hector. I will give maybe Dominique, I think you had some questions and comments. Maybe you can have the last question, and then Alain will actually conclude and close the session.
Yes, thank you to both of you for the presentation. I think they were really great, but I had the feeling that whilst we were discussing this, I'm reading what I wrote we're talking about participatory research, and we're talking about local processes, local representation, social practices. But what do we do with the local knowledge itself? Because every society, you've been talking, Nina, about, for instance, the knowledge that people thought that the herbs were dancing around the house. What do we do with this kind of knowledge? Is it really something we take into consideration, or is it, are we dealing with something else, with the way people are going to accept our research than with local knowledge itself?
So thank you, Dominique. I mean, again, I think it depends. I think it's sort of, it's too abstract to be able to say something about that. There are plenty of projects, I think, where local knowledge really matters, and where we're talking about like classifications of species, or recognition of different kinds of varieties of a particular plant. In those contexts, I think it's really important. Or when we talk about, you might call it practices, but of course knowledge and practices are so intertwined that it's difficult to separate them. But fire, for example, using fire to fight forest fires, or using fire to to clean an area in different ways without it spreading. There's all sorts of knowledge embodied in the practices that it is about, like that projects might need to incorporate, and then whether that flows into some kind of academic paper or some sort of report or a book is another question in a way. But I think we do engage in the work. We do engage with local knowledge, including in this case that I was speaking of, the moment when people talk about the way that their relationship with plants and the forest functions, and that they have relationships with plants that resemble relationships we usually think of as having with other people, so that there is a way of, for example, understanding tending your forest garden as a way of wooing a lover, or raising a child. And so these are attitudes, these are understandings, these are cosmologies that we need to take seriously. And I think they have so much to teach us as well about how to live in the world right now. And it might not always be easy to fold them into a scientific paper, but there might be ways in which you know, as an ethnographer, I can, but like as a natural scientist, it might be more difficult for Aitor to do that. But then, you know, there might be ways in which sometimes we can bring them out, or sometimes maybe it doesn't matter, but we need to engage with them in the moment, and you know, our own understanding, our own worldview, and our own respect for diversity of human cultures thereby gets, I hope, you know, would get widened.
Well, I just a quick answer. I understand perfectly what you say because I'm a social scientist myself. But I was just asking, being provocative, so that because people, all the I mean, more exact sciences or more strong sciences, maybe ask themselves, what do we do? What kind of knowledge are we looking for? So that's why I was asking this. Are we dealing with knowledge? Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Anyway.
Okay, so thank you, Judith, for this presentation. I am exactly what Dominique said. I am a soil scientist and without any knowledge about participating, and it was really enthusiastic by this presentation because I think you draw the line, and it was a good beginning for us to begin to understand what is participatory research and what are the drawbacks to, and you were really honest to show that it's not a fluent process, and it takes time. I completely agree with Hector about bringing this point about evaluation, because we have this problem in France, and I'm sure that there is a lot of other institutes. And I think that there is 2 points we have to really work on. One is to bring this kind of education too in the soil science. I mean, just not at the end, but within the education we have, because we were not trained by in this participatory research, and it's not only a knowledge, but I think it's another way to do research. So it's something important, and so, you know, we have done that under the framework of the CoSavez, which is to bring different kind of knowledge and to discuss. So it's a perfect example of exactly what we want, and you fulfill our expectations. So I just want to thank you for that, Nina and Hector. And I think that the discussion was too short. I think you bring too much point, and this is, I think, could be seen as a beginning, and we will, I think, in the near future, continue in this process. So thank you for bringing this knowledge to us, and I think we will be in contact in the next future. Thank you. And thank you for people who have attended. I think it's time to hit now. So, but we were around 40, so it's quite nice. According to the December, it's always a tight moment. So thank you for both of us. I thank you, Judith, for bringing them to us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Have a good afternoon and have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.